Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik. As always, this is episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. I appreciate everybody listening out there today. If this is your first episode, welcome. We like to have a lot of fun on this podcast, talking all things Major League Baseball. We got a heck of an episode lined up for you here today, talking the latest on the proposed agreement from owners to players. What's the holdup there? We get into a lot of detail around some possibilities that may occur. We then transition into our best of the best segment, going through the American League playoffs in segments 3 and 4 today. That's going to be a lot of fun. And then we're going to wrap up today's episode with some MLB draft talk and then some wacky injuries for the last segment. I was looking up at different injuries, and there are some wacky ones I wanted to bring back up here and discuss with you guys. But if you're new to the pod, once again, please rate, review the podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, scroll down, give us a 5-star review, Spotify, wherever you're listening. And if you're a regular listener of the show, welcome back. I appreciate you guys tuning in today as well for Thursday, May 14th. Episode here on Thursday. I appreciate you guys listening. As always, continue to spread the word of the podcast like I ask you every episode. That allows me to continue to do what I love, which is talk baseball with you guys. So without further ado, let's head into our top segment here, our first segment, talking about the proposal between the owners and the players, where we're at currently, what the holdup is. And everybody's talking about it. I discussed it on Monday's episode on the last podcast, where it seems to be that money right now is the driving factor for whether or not baseball is going to return. Who's making the money? How much of the money are they making? And what are they going to do if they don't make any money? Those are the only things and only conversations you're hearing right now. And it's a shame, because the top conversation should be around safety, but it's not. We'll get to that. We're going to stick within the money category right now. And basically, if you're not up to speed, a few months ago, players and owners agreed to a prorated version of their salary, which we broke down again last episode. But now the owners are asking once again for a further concession from the players. They are talking, quote unquote, revenue sharing, which, if you're a player or if you're a fan of baseball, you know this in baseball is a synonym of a salary cap, and having any sort of salary cap is an absolute no-no and a no-starter when it comes to the players' union and the next bargaining agreement that they will be signing. And even though the proposed revenue is 50-50, and if you look at the other professional sports, football is at 49, I believe NHL is at 48, and basketball can be anywhere from 49 to 51 for the players based on expected revenue and actual revenue and what comes in there. And breaking it down a bit further, again, revenue sharing. So what does that mean? Essentially, they split all the revenue that comes from this year, and salaries will be adjusted accordingly within that revenue. But the difficult part for the players is, and this is a little bit of a confusing conversation, so bear with me here as I try to break it down as easily as possible for you. But there's two types of revenue for Major League Baseball teams. There's local revenue, and then there's national revenue. And, they split the pots, they share them. There's a lot of percentages, a lot of decimals, a lot of math going on there. I was reading some articles, shout out to Jeff Passan at ESPN, wrote a very detailed, long article, but even by the end of reading that, I was like, oh, goodness, okay, what the heck did I just read? So the long short of it for you listeners out there is that local revenue essentially means regional TV contracts, such as the Phillies or with Comcast, Sportsnet, NBC, locally. You have the NBC Bay Area out in the San Francisco area. So you have local TV contracts, and then you have gate revenue or stadium revenue, the parking, the beer, the concessions, all the ticket sales, everything like that goes into the local bucket. And then you have the national revenue, which is essentially postseason revenue, game of the week, Sunday night baseball. Let's see, merchandise and a lot of online content, things like that are all national revenue, which are split. And the argument here from the player side is that they don't have revenue sharing when things are going well. So you don't pay the players more if they're bringing in more fans, driving up more revenue, you're making more money. You're not redispersing that throughout the players. So why now, during a time of concession or a time of, downturn, should they split that revenue? The establishment's going to get all of the profits when things are going well, and then they're trying to split the concessions when things aren't going well within the players. And they're like, no, that's not how it works. If we don't get more when we're doing well, we shouldn't get less when we're doing poorly. But on the flip side, with the ownership in Major League Baseball, there are multiple franchises. They haven't spoken in specifics, but off the top of my head, I would think the Miami Marlins, the Oakland A's. Who else is kind of down in the salary cap world that really struggles? But those two off the top of my head, well, word is if they don't have fans this year and, even lingering effects into next year, that they could go bankrupt. They're going to lose money. They could file for bankruptcy. So the owners are trying to kind of leverage each other and come to some sort of an agreement where teams like the Phillies and the Yankees and those individuals with millions and millions and millions of dollars for local TV compared to other ones which are as little as 25. I think the Phillies are multiple six figures. How they can split that revenue, which will no longer be coming in outside of those TV contracts. So if you don't have fans in Tampa Bay, or if you don't have any fans in Oakland, I know they don't get a lot of fans to begin with, but if you don't have any of them, they're not going to be able to maintain and put out a product. And so this is where the war of words has started within the media. And I got to be honest with you, I'm pleasantly surprised. We talked about it for Monday's episode, listening to the shows, the podcast, everything going on throughout this week. Everybody's taking a similar stance as myself, basically saying that we are in no condition or no place as a country to watch billionaires and millionaires fight over pennies. Essentially, people out here making thousands of dollars, $15,000, $25,000, $50,000 are being let go, are being furloughed, or being laid off. And we're going to have to sit and stare at the television because the millionaire players are worried that the billionaire owners are taking money from their pocket. And basically all we're asking is just give us something to watch. Just give us some normalcy. Break up the rhythm. It is the summer. Allow us to throw on the television and watch one of our favorite sports. The weather's starting to break here on the East Coast. Depending on where you're at listening to this, it may have already turned to summer almost in some parts of America, but going outside, having a bonfire with your family at your house, throwing on the ball game, it's just something we all need right now. And especially with the opportunity to be one of the first sports back, or one of the first sports that has an agreement in place on how it's going to return, to not be able to do that based on money right now, they're going to lose fans. They're going to lose fans that are not going to come back. There was times, 25 years ago, 95, I believe the last strike was, where people were worried about baseball and their fans. And even still, you hear the rhetoric of it's an older generational sport. The average age is getting older. A lot of the younger millennials aren't into the sport. A lot of the Gen Z or Gen Alphas who are coming up now aren't into the sport. And if you basically don't play because of money, you're going to lose a huge opportunity that you're being given here as the sport of baseball to be the first one to return and the first one to give us just a bit of normalcy, back in our lives here. So ultimately, I think they come to an agreement. It's going to be a lot of fun conversation over the next couple of weeks because, yes, even though the owners approved the proposal and sent it to the players, there's going to be a counter proposal and then a counter to the counter proposal, and we're going to be 3, 4, 5 back and forths here until we ultimately come to a conclusion. But the opportunity is too great to squander, and ultimately, I think both parties realize that. The owners, if there's no baseball this year, the tail that could come to this thing into next year is extremely long, extremely crazy, of bankruptcy, relocating, no money, and then from the players' side, they wouldn't have any money going into 2020 free agency. There's just too much at stake here to not have any sort of a baseball season. And from a fan's perspective, we know it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be normal. It's not going to be regular. We've accepted that. We understand that. We just want at least a little bit of baseball, and then hopefully you can get back to normal for 2021. And the same could be said for basketball and hockey. Just try to give us a finale, try to give us some closure, and then we'll work towards next year getting back to where we need to be. So the players need to concede a little bit here. The owners need to concede, whether it's adding interest to payments later in contracts or whatever it may be. There is a solution here to be had. We're going to continue to discuss it over the next couple of weeks as talks continue to progress. We'll continue to keep you guys updated out there on everything that's going on. But that'll wrap it up here for the first segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I appreciate everybody listening out there. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik. We're going to pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors, one of our sister shows within the network. And then when we come back, we're going to get into some of the details around the proposal, some of the new things that you'll be seeing at a ballpark near you, hopefully as soon as possible. Stick around.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. This is episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. We're rocking and rolling here today. We finally got some updated information from Major League Baseball, a little bit of traction on what may happen. The return to play proposal has been presented to the Players Association from the coaches. They've approved it, not the coaches, from the owners. They've approved it and sent it to the players to start the communication back and forth. And the biggest hurdle that seems to be overcome is money and who's going to be making how much of it. We discussed that in detail in the first segment. So here in this segment, we're going to be talking about some of the other little tidbits from the proposal that I thought were interesting, and some of the things that have been rumored to be agreed upon moving forward. That basically is the universal DH. The players, there's been reports that is expected to pass pretty easily, that the National League will be using a designated hitter for 2020. This was a rule that baseball has been trying to slowly implement for a handful of years now, and it could upset some of the old school baseball fans, some people who enjoy National League baseball from National League cities when it comes to managing the ball club, looking at double switches. When's my pitcher due? Do I continue to let him hit? Do I bunt? Do I do a double switch here? Who's up next? Okay, now they're hitting sixth in the lineup. Now it's the 13th inning. Okay, double switch again. It's certainly more difficult to manage in the National League than it is the American League, because you have a designated hitter who is obviously a very good hitter and typically in the middle of your lineup somewhere that you don't have to worry about replacing when it's late in the game, a defensive replacement double switch, so that your relief pitcher doesn't have to hit next inning even though he's due up in the order of a tie ball game in the 8th inning. So there will certainly be less tactical discussions and decisions to be had by the managers moving forward. But from a fan's perspective, from a game's perspective, I would much rather watch David Ortiz hit 4 times a night than have to watch Aaron Nola try to bat 4 times and try to bunt for 3 of them, and then watch the 4th or 5th outfielder on the roster try to come in the bottom of the 8th cold off the bench and pop a double to try to get things going. It's just, it gives an opportunity to an additional player. It's an additional body for a full-time job, additional hitter, and usually a good one. Once again, somebody who you would love to watch as a fan, somebody who every time they're hitting could pop one out of the ballpark, and those are the people that you tend to stick around in the room for and wait for the at-bat to end. So as a fan of the game, I very much enjoy the designated hitter. Again, youth league, thinking back to my time playing, even through high school, you had a designated hitter, sometimes an extra hitter. You had the EH growing up around here. Then when you got to college, you had a DH at the Division I level, and throughout the minor leagues, they use a DH, and then they get to the major leagues, and they expect these guys to hit and hit well. It's just, I think it's time to move on, get a universal DH, get some consistency to the game, the record books line up. Once again, I think it's a good move. And, from a selfish perspective with the Phillies, it'll help them. They'll get Jay Bruce in the lineup, or you're able to use your prospect, Alec Boehm, potentially this year. And there are plenty of clubs down in Atlanta. They can get all 4 outfielders into the lineup now. In New York, you can get Yoenis Cespedes back. In Chicago, there's plenty of bats there that they can use that they can't currently use on an everyday basis. So there are benefits for multiple National League teams that this would certainly improve moving into the summer of 2020. A few other tidbits. The rosters will be expanding from 25 to 30 players. We talked about 28, 29 potentially here on this podcast. It looks like that number is going to be 30, which again is more money for potential players there, 25 through 30. The next level is there's going to be a 20-player quote-unquote taxi league, which essentially means a minor league team who will be within a taxi ride distance of the ball club. These people will be used for injuries. These people will be used for performance issues, being sent up and down to the minors. So essentially the roster is going to be about 50 people, with 30 people being active. And the other ones you can switch on a weekly basis. People or teams like to shuffle up and down bullpen members. When you get into the heart of the summer, every 10 days, 12 days that you have to be down, come back up, kind of keep your arm fresh that way. Not so much the rest of your body traveling all over America, but keeping your arm fresh. So that taxi league is essentially, like I said, injury replacement. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, what happens if somebody goes down? That taxi league will have those individuals prepared and continuing to play games so they can come right in and put a nice product on the field. There was confirmation, we discussed it, but a 14-team playoff, 7 teams per conference, first round, best of 3. I talked about how they can't do a best of 1 wild card for each of these teams, but no travel. It'll be held at the higher seeded site, 3 games, and the bullet point here, which we discussed months back now at this point, that was originally floated around in one of the proposals is that the first seed gets a bye. Okay, no problem. Well, divisional winners number 2 and number 3 will get to pick out of the wild card teams. They will get to decide who they want to play, whether it's the 7 seed or the 4 seed, depending on matchups, depending on past experience. If you guys are in the same division and you don't want to play them because you see them all the time, they're able to pick that. So the number 2 team could pick number 4, number 3 could pick number 7, and then you got 5 and 6 playing each other. It's not your standard NFL 1 gets a bye, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4, 5. It'll allow teams to pick their opposition. And once again, I think those are fascinating storylines, fantastic storylines that could come out here. Basically, imagine if you were the Atlanta Braves and you have to pick between, let's go Phillies and Cubs when it comes to the wild card. Well, you want to pick the Phillies because they're in your division. You think you match up well with their pitching staff. But then you haven't seen the Cubs, so okay, you pick the Phillies. Well, now the Phillies are sitting there in their clubhouse knowing that Atlanta wanted you. They had the opportunity to choose to go against another team, and they decided themselves that they are better situated for you and to eliminate you. And the team, whoever it may be in that instance, would obviously take it personally. I'm just thinking back to myself in college. If one team was like, we choose them, it's like, okay, baby, it's on. Let's go. We're going to run this. If you want us, you're going to get the storm. So that could be fascinating to watch, even though the superior team, the underdog, is going to be very, very motivated when it comes to that first round series. And I'm definitely excited to watch that. But I teased it in the first segment and ending it and concluding the second segment here with it. But we hear all this talk about money, all this talk about location and travel. Well, there's no talk about safety going on, which should be the number one concern right now of all players. They're not discussing the amount of tests they would need done. They're not talking about what to do if the league needs to shut down because of a positive test. Is it just that individual? Is it that entire team? Is it that team and any team they've played within the last 2 weeks? Because then essentially you just start the snowball that happened in March where, oh, well, they played them and they played them. And then by the time you're 5 deep here, it's every team in the league could possibly have been exposed. And if travel is even less than the standard NBA season, it's going to happen sooner and quicker than that opportunity. Or do you just shut down that region? If somebody for the Phillies gets tested, do you just shut down the NL East and the AL East? Because those are the only teams playing each other based on this situation like we discussed. Do you just shut down the NL West if somebody on the Dodgers comes up with this virus? Shut down the NL West and the AL West, but the Central and East are allowed to play on because they're not traveling. And then when it comes playoff time, is that just division eliminated from the playoffs and then they restructure with the Central and the East? And there's a ton left on the table here to discuss. And a lot of it has to do with safety, which should be number one. And obviously it's not. It's a business. It's America. It's money. It's what runs the show. But just the safety of the individuals at a time like this is the most important part. And as a fan, I have buddies again who are in the league, quote unquote sources, whatever you want to call it, talking to players. That's a concern individually, but it's certainly not a move that they've made in the media or something that the media is talking about right now. All of the discussion is about how the owners are going to want them to take less and the players don't want to do it. So where do we go now? And it's a shame because that's not where the conversation should be. Here we are, in day 65 of the quarantine out there. But hopefully they can figure it out. I think this proposal is the best of a worse situation. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but good is better than nothing. And right now we have nothing. So anything in the positive direction, we're certainly hopeful for and looking forward to. But we're going to keep you guys updated as things move along here. I'm sure we'll have more by Monday's episode discussing the latest proposal, counter proposal, what's going on. So make sure you keep tuning in, catching your update as well. But that wraps up the second segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We're going to pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors and one of our sister shows. But when we come back, we're going to break down the American League in the best of the best segment, and we're going to let you guys know who ultimately makes the playoffs. So you're going to want to stick around, man. This bracket is loaded. Hang with us.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, as always, Kevin Mahalik. This is episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. Do me a favor, leave us a 5-star rating, write us a review. If you leave a review, I'll read it here on the show, as well as head to social media, head to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Check out the GSMC Podcast Network, as well as the GSMC Baseball Podcast. We post a lot of articles on there, what we're going to talk about on the show, all the latest episodes. If you happen to miss one, it keeps you guys up to date on everything going on Major League Baseball and everything going on GSMC. But now it's my favorite segment of the show. These next couple of segments talking about the best of the best. We're getting close to the finish line here. It's not going to be today, but this Sunday it is going to be the last episode that involves which team is the best of the best in the history of Major League Baseball. Last episode, we did the National League, and eventually the 1976 Reds came out on top of the 2001 Diamondbacks and that squad there. Now we're transitioning over into the American League, and a reminder for everybody out there who I have in which divisions, where their rankings, and ultimately where I think they end up in the postseason. Starting out with the AL East from number 5 to number 1. Number 5, the 2008 Devil Rays. Number 4, the 1993 Blue Jays. Number 3, the 1970 Orioles. Number 2, the 2004 Red Sox. And number 1, the 1998 New York Yankees. So the Yankees obviously advance to the postseason, winning the American League East in this quote-unquote fantasy best of the best segment. Transitioning to the AL Central, number 5, 2016 Cleveland Indians. Number 4, 1991 Twins. Number 3, 2015 Royals. Number 2, 2005 White Sox. And the winner of the AL Central the 1984 Tigers. The 84 Tigers advanced to the postseason and clinched by winning the AL Central. In the American League West, we have number 5, the 2011 Texas Rangers. Number 4, 2019 Houston Astros. Number 3, 2001 Mariners. Number 2, 2002 Angels. And number 1, 1973 Oakland Athletics. So, our 3 obvious postseason and seeded 1 through 3, but in which order? Our 1 through 3, number 1 seed obviously being a big deal because just like we talked about last segment 2, talking about the proposal for 2020, in this scenario, there's 7 playoff teams as well. So number 1 is getting an opening round bye, and that number 1 team is the 1998 New York Yankees. They will advance into the divisional round. Sit out wild card weekend is what I'll call it, since it'll be a best of let's call it a best of 5 in this scenario. Even though they're doing 3 in real life here, we did a best of 5 in our simulation, our fantasy world, and the Yankees advance. That leaves the number 2 seed, the 1984 Detroit Tigers, and then the number 3 seed, 1973 Oakland Athletics. And, you know, I wasn't as progressive enough. I wasn't as futuristic in my thinking to allow those teams to then pick which wild card teams they would want to play in the first round. So I continued through 4 through 7 discussing who could ultimately make the postseason and where I think they will be. And once again, looking at the American League East, you have the 04 Red Sox, 1970 Orioles, and then the 93 Blue Jays as potential wild card teams. The American League Central, you have the 05 White Sox, 15 Royals, and 91 Twins up for a potential playoff spot. And then out west, pretty much the 2002 Angels. I have the 2001 Mariners there as well, but World Series champions, it's going to be the 2002 Angels. So that breaks up number 4. I have the 2004 Boston Red Sox. I think they're runners-up in the AL East, the first wild card on the list here, making the slot here in number 4. So then that means the matchups, number 4, the Red Sox, they'll face this next team, number 5, in the wild card slot. Well, I have that one as the 2005 White Sox, the AL Central runner-up. I will continue down the list of teams, but I think they finished just ahead of the number 6 team just due to the 04 Sox and the 98 Yankees being very, very good. But that number 6 team I have is the 1970 Orioles. I have that rotation making the postseason here. I have them in the 6th spot once again because I think the 98 Yankees were so good. And then the 04 Red Sox are going to win a ton of games as well, that the 70 Orioles will win enough to make the postseason, but just less than the 05 White Sox, who, along with the 84 Tigers, will beat up on the AL Central. But that's the last AL East team. I think there's quite a gap from the 70 Orioles and the 04 Red Sox down to the 93 Blue Jays, which essentially brought the conversation then to, do I think it's the 2015 Royals or the 2002 Angels ultimately fighting for that last playoff spot coming down the stretch? I gave the edge to the 2002 Angels. I think we need a West Coast team, another one here besides the Athletics out there. And I think the Angels squeak in that 2002 squad ultimately makes the postseason. So that gives us matchups that we're going to break down here. Let's go through the first round in this segment. That leaves rounds 2 and 3 for the next round to finish up conversation. But that leaves the number 2 Tigers and the number 7 2002 Angels. Game 1 will be a matchup between Jack Morris for the Tigers and Ramon Ortiz for the Angels. Game 2 is Don Petrie and Jared Washburn. And then Game 3, Milt Wilcox and Kevin Appier going for the Angels. And the 84 Tigers, there's too much there for the 02 Angels. Morris, Petrie, I don't know exactly which one that is. Wilcox, I think the rotation there is much stronger than Ortiz, Washburn, and Appier. You know, looking at that 02 Angels squad, it was a good ball club, but it's not in the same class as the 84 Tigers. I have the Detroit Tigers moving on in 4, not going the distance here, winning this series, and moving on to the divisional round to see who will they take on. To be continued. But the next matchup, number 3, the 1973 Athletics face off on the 1970 Orioles, and the pitching matchups are as followed. games 1 through 3 because you only need 3 starters for, best of 5. So ultimately, I think that's where they shut it down. Later on, we'll talk about 4 starters deep. But 1973 Athletics, they'll run out Ken Holtzman against Jim Palmer. Vida Blue for the Athletics. I think I said Vida in past episodes, but Vida Blue, he'll go against Mike Cuellar. So this was a battle of the mispronunciations for myself in past episodes. Vida Blue versus Mike Cuellar. Well, it's Cuellar. So thank you to the listeners out there who interacted with the show online on social media. Help me out with the correct pronunciation there. So we got in Game 3, Catfish Hunter and then Dave McNally going there. So the 73 Athletics and the 70 Orioles, I think this is the best first-round matchup in the American League. Both of these teams are absolutely loaded, absolutely stacked. The Orioles as a 6 seed may have been a division winner elsewhere if they weren't in the East in this particular season, but I went with the upset. I gave one upset in the National League. I think this is the one upset, spoiler alert, for the American League, and I'm taking the 6 seed, 1970 Orioles, to advance in 5 games. I think this one goes the distance just because of the Athletics offense, but ultimately that rotation of Palmer, Cuellar, and McNally getting you 4.5, at least 4 starts out of 5 games would be enough for them to take this series in advance. And then the final matchup in the first round, the 2004 Red Sox versus the 2005 White Sox. The Battle of the Sox, right back-to-back years here. So if you guys watching baseball in the early 2000s, try to remember who you think would win this matchup. Games here, number 1, Curt Schilling going against Mark Burley. Game 2 would be Pedro Martinez versus Freddie Garcia. And number 3, Tim Wakefield versus John Garland. And truly, Mark Burley, he's better than people remember. He had his moments, obviously, no hitters, perfect games, all of the above. Freddie Garcia, this is early Freddie, when Freddie was dealing, not old Freddie, when he got to Philadelphia and was injured and couldn't really muster anything anymore. And then John Garland, a solid number 3. But the 04 Red Sox are just too deep, too strong. Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, and then Schilling, Martinez, Wakefield. There's just too much there. And ultimately, the 04 Red Sox advance in 4 games against the 05 White Sox. So the 84 Tigers advance in 4 games against the 02 Angels. The 1970 Orioles advance against the 1973 Athletics in 5 games. And then the 04 Red Sox beat the 05 White Sox and advance to the divisional round in the American League. But that'll wrap it up for the first segment here, the third segment, but the first one of the best of the best. We're going to continue this conversation in segment 4 after we pause here for a word from one of our sister shows and a word from one of our sponsors. But I am your host, Kevin Mahalik. As always, this is the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I appreciate everybody listening out to episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. Hang around with us. We're going to talk around the rest of the American League playoffs when we come back. It's going to be a fight to the finish. Stick around.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
Welcome back, and thank you for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik. As always, this is episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. I appreciate everybody listening out there. If you're just tuning in now, we appreciate it. We talked about the latest proposal between the Major League Baseball and the MLBPA, how money is the root of all evil, especially when it comes to media coverage and communication right now around baseball and the latest proposal to return to play. Not the safety or health concerns of the players, the owners, everybody involved, but the money. Who's going to make it? How much? And it's tough right now to listen to these conversations in the economy and where we're at as a country in regards to the pandemic, and money still being the cause that we may not get baseball. Is frustrating as a fan. But right now we're in our best segment here, the best of the best, talking the American League playoffs. We're down to the divisional round here. We have the number 1 seed and the team that got a bye into this round, the 1998 New York Yankees. And they advanced to face the lowest seed, and that was the upset from the wild card weekend. That was the 6th seed 1970 Baltimore Orioles. That'll be one semifinal. And then in the other semifinal, the 1984 Detroit Tigers, the number 2 seed, take on the number 4 squad, the 2004 Red Sox. So starting at the top with the 98 Yankees and the 1970 Orioles. Part of me thinks that these may be 2 of the best 4 teams to ever play. I know we talked about the National League, the 76 Reds, the 01 Diamondbacks. There's a few others in there, the 95 Braves. But this 70 Orioles team, the more I research about it, the more I read about it, the more I engage with fans who are alive and watch this team because, again, confession, I'm 31 years old, born in 1989, so I wasn't even a thought in 1970. I didn't see any of these guys. I just know the history of the game, the statistics that were involved, and kind of the communication around the style of that team as well. And even with the 98 Yankees, being a 9-year-old kid, you really don't know a ton about the sport at that point. You're still just having fun. You know you're good at it. You know you're playing it at a high level, but you don't really understand and appreciate greatness when it's happening at that moment. But looking back on both of these units, just incredible what they were able to accomplish. 3 20-game winners on the Orioles side of things, and then just the video game lineup for the Yankees on the other side of things. And the pitching matchup for this unit here, we have Game 1, Andy Pettitte. He will go against Jim Palmer for the Orioles. Let's see, Game 2 would be David Wells against Mike Cuellar. Game 3, David Cone against Dave McNally. And then in Game 4, because now we're in a 7-game series, so ultimately you need 4 starters when it comes to this, it'll be Orlando Hernandez, or El Duque, for the 98 Yankees and his big leg kick, going against Jim Harden for the 1970 Orioles. And there's a bit of a drop-off to Harden from the first 3, and they're 20-game winners. But breaking down the series, the first 2 games being in New York, I'm going to take a split for the Yankees. I know Palmer and Cuellar on paper are probably an advantage over Pettitte and Wells. Yankee Stadium, road game, that's a split. You go to Baltimore, you get Cone and El Duque versus McNally and Harden. I think the Orioles take a 2-1 lead there, but then El Duque wins Game 4. We're back to New York. Andy Pettitte's Andy Pettitte. He wins Game 5 at home. Game 6, Mike Cuellar steps up, wins that one at home over David Wells. And then you got a Game 7 where it's Dave McNally and that bullpen going against David Cone, followed by Orlando Hernandez. And the Yankees offense of Tino Martinez, Chuck Knobloch, Derek Jeter, Scott Brosius, Bernie Williams, Paul O'Neill, Dale Strawberry, Jorge Posada. I think they break down the Orioles and get over that hump in Game 7 and ultimately advance to the ALCS. I'm going 98 Yankees in 7 games just due to the bullpen and some of the depth when it comes to the offense there for the Yanks as well. So Yankees advance. Next up, we got the 84 Tigers and the 04 Red Sox. Again, I don't know a ton about the 1984 Tigers, but the more I read, the more I learn, the more that they were a great ball club. The 04 Red Sox, that's when I was in high school. I really appreciated that team, but they were down 3-0 to the Yankees. If it wasn't for 4 nights in October in Boston and New York, we're not talking about this squad being at the top here. But looking at the pitching matchup, Jack Morris against Curt Schilling, Dan Petrie against Pedro Martinez, Milt Wilcox versus Tim Wakefield, and then Juan Beringer versus Derek Lowe. And breaking it down once again, games 1 and 2 are in Detroit. I'll go split. Games 3 and 4 in Boston. I'll go split again. I think the Tigers get to the knuckleballer. Game 5 I'll give to Curt Schilling. Game 6, I'll give to Petrie. And then Game 7, I like Milt Wilcox over Tim Wakefield, as well as just Parrish behind the dish, and then the balance of Lemon, Gibson, Evans, Whitaker, Trammell, Johnson offensively for the Tigers. I think they get to Wakefield and Lowe, and that combination in Game 7, going from a knuckleballer to a sinker baller, can be tough for an offense to kind of, get a rhythm and get their pace going. But personally, I think that the 84 Tigers are able to get it done. And I know that the offense for the Red Sox in 04 is very, very good. Don't get me wrong. Manny Ramirez, Johnny Damon, Gabe Kapler, David Ortiz, Kevin Millar, Jason Varitek. But I just think those names and those that balance from the Tigers ultimately allows them to advance. And that brings us to an ALCS of the 1998 Tigers versus the 98 Yankees and the 84 Tigers, the number 1 seed versus the number 2 seed. Once again, Game 1, Andy Pettitte versus Jack Morris. David Wells going against Dan Petrie. Game 2, David Cohn, Milt Wilcox, and Orlando Hernandez El Duque versus Juan Barringer in Game 4. Back and forth, I think it goes in the ALCS as well. Andy Pettitte, Jack Morris, Wells, Petrie, back and forth. And ultimately, honestly, I think the Yankees win in 6. Like I said, I think the 70 Orioles would be a little bit of a tougher matchup for the 98 Yankees, just because the Yankees video game lineup going against those 3 20-game winners may have a little bit more difficult than going against the 84 the 84 Tigers. They got a strong rotation, the 84 Tigers, but it's not what the 70 Orioles are. And I think the 98 Yankees just continue to beat up offensively on anybody that they run into. And it's an interesting conversation because it generally, pitching wins championships. Offense wins games, pitching wins championships. Now, if you're looking at a World Series of the 98 Yankees and the 76 Reds, the Big Red Machine, that's a lot of offense coming in there. It's not the 70 Orioles versus the team with the second best rotation ever. The 2011 Phillies who didn't win it with the 4 horsemen. But, yeah, it's an offensive game here in the fantasy world of the best team ever for Major League Baseball history. But tune into Monday's episode. We're going to break down the World Series, full Game 7, try to talk about what we think's ultimately going to happen, the starting pitching matchups, some of the pitching hitting matchups that could happen later in games, and we're going to pick a winner. I'm also going to ask you guys on some of the social media platforms who you guys think would win between the 76 Reds and the 1998 Yankees. But those are the two squads. The 98 Yankees win the American League. The 76 Reds win the National League. Ultimately, after doing this, I do think the American League's a little bit deeper. Looking at the best of the best, the top 4 of Yankees, Tigers, Red Sox, Orioles is very, very strong, and I think may slightly outpace what the National League was putting out there. But once again, that could be, due to the designated hitter. I'm not mentioning David Ortiz in the National League. And here I am talking about, wow, he's a big reason as to why the 04 Red Sox are currently where they are. But hopefully you guys have been enjoying that. Honestly, I've had a lot of fun looking at that, using Baseball Reference, looking at statistics, looking at matchups, breaking it all down. Hopefully you guys agree with me out there, or at least not too far off some of my predictions. But let me know where you disagree. Hit me up on Facebook, DM me on Twitter. Certainly open for conversation. If you want to leave a review and write it in the review, we'll read that here on the show. We'll talk about why you think it should have been the 04 Red Sox advancing and not the 98 Yankees. I'm certainly open for conversation. But that wraps it up, guys, here for the 4th segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. That was a lot of fun, but we're going to transition a little bit when we come back after the break. We're going to be talking about the MLB Draft. Yes, there's been confirmation, 5 rounds down from 40, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the prospects, some of the positions they're playing, and ultimately break down some higher-level conversation on this year's class and what you can expect coming up in June when the MLB holds their draft. So stick around with us. We'll be right back. This is Kevin Mahalik and the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks for listening.
Are Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back, everybody, to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. I appreciate everybody listening. Real quick, do me a favor, head to social media. Follow, like, subscribe, rate, review everything about the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Apple Podcasts, all of the above. We appreciate everything you're doing to help spread the word here within the GSMC Podcast Network. Shout out to you guys real quick before we get into the MLB draft and everything else that goes along with that, because the numbers are growing within the Baseball Podcast. We just looked at the numbers for April a few weeks ago. They're up from January, so that means you guys are listening out there. I'm asking you to share this podcast with one person a week. If you do that every week moving forward, obviously the numbers grow exponentially quite quickly, and we're on that track. So continue to help us out here. The more you guys share the podcast helps me out as I can continue to bring you guys quality content and be behind the microphone and talking with you guys about Major League Baseball and everything that's going to be happening. And hopefully within a month or so, we'll be talking about actual baseball. We should have been doing that for 6-7 weeks now, but we're almost 6-7 weeks away when it breaks down to it. But here in the fifth segment, like we talked about, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the Major League Draft, what to expect coming up here, typically in the month of June. This year it's been moved to July, pushed back just a little bit. It's also been confirmed, as we talked about in the past, it'll be 5 rounds instead of 40. There was the potential to be anywhere from 5 rounds to 20. Well, Major League Baseball and their cost-cutting measures that they're currently trying to implement, they're all the way down to 5. And then teams are allowed to sign as many unrestricted free agents as they would like for a maximum of $20,000, which is way, way less than 6th round picks or 10 round picks would have gotten in the past. But last week we discussed some names and some individuals, did a first round mock draft, kind of run through everything to discuss. We could pull up one of those here a little bit later, but first off, I just wanted to take a step back and kind of look at the prospect list and discuss from where they're coming, who they are, because, you know, those of you who just watched the NFL draft, well, those are all college kids who have been in college at least 3 years, if not 4 years, fifth-year seniors. You know who's eligible. You have an understanding. Well, the baseball draft's a little bit more unique, a little bit more fun to follow because the prospect pool is obviously much greater. The rule is you can either be drafted out of high school or you need to be 3 years removed from high school. It doesn't have to be at a 4-year university. Could go to a JUCO, could do any sort of travel there that you'd like within that world of possibilities. So there are a ton of names that could be looked at. But I use source MLB.com, kind of looking at their top prospects, their top 200, breaking down kind of what's going on there. And a few things jumped out at me was that out of the top 50 prospects, 18 were college arms. And by arms, I mean pitchers. Teams usually go college higher in the draft, and this is typically true as well. The closer you get to the draft, the more mock drafts tend to put college kids higher and higher. But, well, that's due to the college year that they just had. And they're older individuals. They're a little bit easier to project moving forward. A lot of times, they're high risers, quick risers. Years ago, the Phillies took Aaron Nola at LSU because they needed a starting pitcher fast, and they knew that he was a year or two away from Major League ready, as opposed to taking a high school arm who maybe has a little bit more top-end talent, throwing 100 miles an hour instead of 94. but it's going to take longer to develop, going to need more years for his body to mature, for his mind to mature, and for him to kind of understand how to use his body and grow into his body, as opposed to a college senior who's 21, 22 years old, has an understanding physically of what they can do and mentally what they're trying to do when they're on the mound. So the 18 out of top 50 being college arms, not super surprising, again, because sayings within the industry are grow the arms, buy the bats, if you have to do it that way, meaning you want to draft and develop pitching and a lot of it, and then you can typically buy your offense on the free agent market. There's a lot more offense available in free agent than there are arms. Just looking at the top end of the rotation guys who have gone in the past couple of years, Corbin to Washington, Cole to the Yankees, and the dollars that they've pulled in, and even the likes of a Jake Arrieta, who was clearly in a decline coming off, yes, had won a Cy Young, but was still able to get $75 million in 3 years at a pretty good clip, unlike some of these outfielders. A.J. Pollock, I think, took $40 or $50 million over 4 years at that 10 to 12 range. So draft and grow the arms and then buy the bats. But continuing in this top 200, 112 are currently at a 4-year college or 4-year college players. That leaves 81 high school players and then 7 junior college players currently in the top 200 for MajorLeague.com. A little bit top heavy when it comes to 112 and 81. It's not surprising because, again, these are prospects, and this is not what your team needs or what your team is trying to accomplish. This is just a scout or individuals looking at it saying, hey, no team, no entry, just skill-wise on a scale of 0 to 60. Where is he? How's he doing? You know, how long is it going to take for him to develop? Things like that, which is why high school kids, as much as college, can end up on these prospect lists because these kids are throwing 95, 96. They don't know where it's going yet because mechanically they're still all over the place. Fundamentally, they're not as sound and they're not able to repeat their delivery as fluidly as the college guys who have worked on their craft for a number of years. And it just leads to a little bit more injury concern when it comes to the high school kids. I had a high school buddy. He's in the Rocky organization. He was a first-round pick a few years back. Hasn't really been able to get his career off the ground just due to arm injuries and concerns, but lit it up in high school. So there is that cause of, well, they haven't thrown the 100 innings yet, 80 innings that comes with being a college pitcher. They haven't been on a routine yet of once a week, I'm throwing every Friday. This is what I need to get done for my body to be ready to go. They just haven't experienced that next level of competition, commitment, and everything it takes to be a college ball player. So it's an interesting discussion internally with these organizations of if they go college or high school, where are you at with your rebuilding process? What are the next windows of years you're looking at to contend? Because the Phillies, they're getting closer. So it wouldn't surprise me if they go a college arm because their starting pitching isn't where they want it to be. And maybe in a year or two, somebody at that level could help them as opposed to a high school kid who's going to take 5 years. And then you're looking at the tail end of the next window. So continuing the breakdown of the top 200, 109 are pitchers. It's a heavier class on the arms this year. Last year, only 93 of 200 were pitchers. So a plus 16 ratio from year over year in regards to position. 77 of the 109 are right-handed pitchers. So a heavy right-handed pitching draft class. That is standard. I don't know the exact ratio, but plenty more right-handers than left-handers out there. So for the 32 left-handed pitchers to fill out the rest of the 109, we'll see where they go. Lefties can be all over the place, whether it's a tall, lanky high school kid or a college kid. There's a lot more unknown with lefties. I don't know what it is, but it's just one of those things. 34 outfielders in the top 200 for prospects, 20 shortstops, 14 third basemen, 12 catchers, 7 first basemen. I thought that was a little bit low. Typically at the high end of the power structure and the offensive structure is the college first baseman. So to see only 7, that's all right. That makes me feel better why I wasn't on that as a second-team All-American back in the day. What's up with that? But there's only 7, so they can't all be All-Americans. And then you had 4 second basemen. So a lot of pitchers, again, mostly outfielders, sprinkling in some infielders. Apparently the middle infield, only having about 24 total shortstops and second basemen, is weaker for a class perspective, which means the arms could go a little bit higher this year than they would in other years just due to supply and demand and what's going on. When it comes to colleges, out of the 112 at four-year colleges, Arizona State has the most entries here with 6. In second place, there's a couple of schools tied. Miami, Michigan, and Vanderbilt all have 4 prospects on the list, or players from their programs representing themselves. And then lastly, the last breakdown I looked at was the states. And if I gave you 3 guesses on the top 3 states, 100% of you are getting 2. 95% of you are getting all 3. 29 from the state of Florida, 27 from the state of California, and then 21 from the state of Texas. Deep in the heart of Texas. So Florida, California, and Texas, very similar to football, as well as baseball, the most prospects representing those states. But that wraps it up for the 5th segment here, guys. That was actually a lot of fun as well. I enjoyed talking draft with everybody out there. We're going to continue to talk Major League Draft from now until July as more and more information comes out between now and then. Obviously, keep you updated on Major League Baseball and what's happening. But if we don't get MLB, we're going to talk draft because they've said that will take place. But that wraps up the 5th segment here of the GSMC Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik, as always. When we come back, we're going to wrap up today's show talking about wacky injuries that have happened in the past. Just kind of going through the history. I got to thinking about some injuries, and there are some interesting names and injuries on this list. So stick around. We're going to pause for a word from one of our sponsors, one of our sister shows, and then we'll be back to wrap up today's episode. Stick around.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello and welcome back to the final segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. This is episode number 188 of the Baseball Podcast. I'll ask you one last time, please scroll up on your Apple iPhone right now. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating, write a review. If you're listening on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever those other programs are, there's plenty of them out there that we're available on where you could be getting this content. I appreciate you guys listening there as well. Leave us a review if possible. Head to social media. You can follow us, like, subscribe as well. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, both the GSMC Baseball Pod and the GSMC Podcast Network. We bring you guys a lot of updated information. You can stay up to date with everything that's going on within the network itself. But wrapping up today's show, we're having a little bit of fun. And to let you guys know how we arrived at this current segment, which is going to be wacky Major League Baseball injuries that have happened in the past, it's because of, we mentioned it last Thursday's episode, but The Masked Singer and the show on Fox where, everybody's singing in crazy masks and you're trying to figure out who it is. Well, the Rhino was revealed last night, if you're listening to this today on the 14th, and it was indeed Barry Zito. Barry Zito was up there singing for the last 7 or 8 weeks or so. He's actually got a very good voice, and he outlasted some actual musicians on the show. He put on a good performance, and I was thinking Barry Zito. It got me thinking back to the 2012 Giants, which were the team that represented the Giants on the best of the best situation in the segment that we did there. His teammate Madison Bumgarner has had a few run-ins when it comes to wacky MLB headlines or injuries in the past, and his one injury to talk about happened back in 2017, And that was he hurt his shoulder while he was dirt bike racing. And this past offseason, he made headlines by being in the rodeo under a fake name. Him and his wife were doing it, going around doing rodeos. Well, in the past, he was doing dirt bike races, hurt his shoulder, missed almost an entire year, still got a $100 million contract. So clearly doesn't really care the repercussions because still gets his money, still performs on the mound. Well, because of that connection, I then got to thinking, well, what are some of the other wacky injuries that have taken place in the history of Major League Baseball? And I will say within the last 5 years, there's more of these to discuss than from years 1983 to 2006, which is as far back as I could, find injuries and goofiness that occurred with it. So breaking some of these down here, going through the list. In 2019 alone, last summer, there were 4 individuals who had wacky MLB injuries. Starting off first was Hunter Strickland, a relief pitcher for the Nationals. He was working out with a barbell. I was reading he was having it strapped somewhere trying to balance. Well, that didn't work. Ultimately, he ended up breaking his nose with the barbell while working out on the road, I believe it was. But he ended up benefiting, I guess, or it was the best of a worse situation because it was a clean break of the nose, which he then was able to pitch through in just a couple of days. So some of these guys with these injuries coming up missed multiple months. Well, Hunter was only able to miss multiple days, even though he had a scar on his face to prove the embarrassment along with the injury that had occurred just recently. There was also Carlos Correa last year. He had a broken rib from a massage. I don't know who's doing the massage or what type of massage he's getting where he could possibly break a rib. But if we're going deep tissue, man, I don't know. Is this woman, I presume, dancing on your back? Is she tap dancing? And that's how you break a rib? I mean, how do you just get in there with your hands and break a rib? It just, I don't know. It doesn't add up. But he ended up missing a month, almost 5 weeks. With the injury, it was a big concern for the Astros, and he was able to make it back down the stretch, but really wasn't the same guy. So a big injury in Houston last year. You also had Yoenis Cespedes for the Mets. Last offseason, he had an injury on his ankle. He had both of his heels and his feet surgically repaired. It originally came out that he did this while working out back in his home country. But then as time continued to pass, as information continues to leak out more and more, he was running from a boar in his home country in the offseason. Now, I guess my question is, I just said running from. I don't know if it's confirmed. Was he running from the boar or to the boar? Was he running at it to hunt it, or was he running away from it because it was chasing him? These are the details I think you need to know when you have a situation where a guy making millions or hundreds of millions hurts his ankle because of a wild animal in his home country during the offseason. You also had Blake Snell. Coming off a Cy Young performance in 2018, he was moving furniture around. Apparently didn't read the instructions or look at the furniture and realize the top of the furniture was connected to the bottom of the furniture. So when he lifted it up, the bottom fell out, cracked him on the toe. He ended up breaking a toe and missing an extended amount of time because he was moving apartments earlier. It's just the little things. I'm going, oh my God, no way. He can't play because he was moving a furniture around. It just, man, fascinating. 2018, Sean Kelly, he cut his finger. He cut the tip almost clean off. He was washing dishes in the sink. Apparently forgot a knife was in there or missed the knife and slit his finger. He missed quite a few bit of starts just due to not being able to hold the ball or throw the ball. There was also Salvador Perez in 2018. He hurt his knee carrying luggage. I think he was on vacation before spring training and was carrying luggage up some steps, slipped, fell, ended up tearing up his knee, then eventually tore the ACL. He'll be back this year in 2020, coming off a 19 knee surgery. Just, oh my God, just happenstance. On vacation, going up the steps, and boom, there's a knee and future problems for the next couple of years. 2017, Madison Bumgarner we talked about. 2016, you have Trevor Bauer. He sliced his finger. You guys remember him pitching in the postseason, I believe it was, with blood dripping down his finger. People are like, what's going on? It came out after the game that he was playing with his drone back in 2016. This is when drones were first starting to become a thing at the, the home level, not just, a fantasy, but you could play with them at home. And he was trying to fix one or put it together or do something. He ended up slicing his finger Well, that led to him bleeding during the game, and it was just a scene to be had post-game, him talking about a drone and why this injury occurred. And then you have Jeremy Affeldt, who's a multi-time offender when it comes to this category. His most recent one was in 2015 when he hurt his knee playing at home with his kids. I guess his 4-year-old caught him in an awkward position, took him down, and he banged up his knee a little bit there. Just amazing. That was a second or third time he had a wacky injury. But once you get past 2015, you get almost 10 years then. So from 2015 to 2019, you had, 4, 6, 9, and then 2016 to 83, only 5 occurred that fit this category. So back in 2006, my high school days, Joel Zamaya, a 100-mile-an-hour relief pitcher, he hurt his wrist because he was playing Guitar Hero. He got Guitar Hero on PlayStation 2 for his son, ended up playing it all night. He woke up the next day, his wrist was bothering him, he couldn't play, and it's just, man, I couldn't imagine playing video games being the reason why you have to tell your coach you have to miss extended time. You then have 2004, Sammy Sosa hurts his back because of a violent sneeze or multiple sneezes. I'm not sure, again, was it one sneeze, a couple of sneezes? Well, he ended up having a back problem because they were so violent. 1994, Steve Sparks, he hurt his shoulder because he was trying to rip a phone book in half. I guess 1994, that was when that was becoming a thing. Hulk Hogan making it popular in WWE, I assume. I was just a young kid at that age, but tore up his labrum or rotator cuff trying to rip a phone book in half. 1990, Glenn Allen Hill, he cuts up his entire body. He fell through a glass table. I don't know what was going on there. Typically, I know somebody who did that. It was late on the weekend and in college, but I don't know what Glenn Allen Hill was doing that he fell through the table. And then the last one in 1983, George Brett was in one room in his house. Let's call it the laundry room. Well, one of his buddies, he was watching a baseball game. He was up to bat. He heard this. He came running from the other room into the room to watch his buddy. Well, on the way, he kicks a door square, ends up breaking his pinky toe, misses a month to 2 months because he was running from the laundry room to the living room to try to watch his buddy taking at bat on Sunday Night Baseball. It's just, man, the interesting, wacky injuries that have taken place over the course of the history of Major League Baseball. I thought it was just a nice, light, fun way to end today's episode. So that wraps it up, guys. That's episode number 188 of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik, as always. If you guys enjoyed today's episode, once again, like, subscribe, rate, review. If not, let me know how to do better, and we'll be back with another episode coming up on Monday. So you guys stay safe, stay home out there, try to flatten this curve as quick as we can so we get baseball back as soon as possible. Shout out to all the healthcare workers, everybody out there on the front lines, all the essential workers, grocery stores, gas stations, whoever it is out there, wherever you're working. We appreciate it. Once again, Kevin Mahalik, GSMC Baseball Podcast. Have a nice night, everyone.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.